Hey y'all, welcome to this week's episode of Unfit to Print. I'm your host Amber Athey. I'm the Washington editor for The Spectator and a senior Blankley fellow with the Steamboat Institute. Before we get started, please be sure to subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And if you would like to become a subscriber and get access to all kinds of bonus content, head on over to amberathey.supercast.com. We've got a lot to cover this week, including some recent Supreme Court victories for conservatives, as well as an update on the Biden border crisis. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. Where was I last week, and why is the show a day late? Well, the answer is last week I finally got COVID. And it wasn't that bad. I basically had one really awful day where I was on the couch, super exhausted. But since then have been pretty much going about my normal life. But after I got COVID, which was on the day that I was supposed to film last week, I also ended up moving to a new apartment, which you guys can see behind me. We have a totally new set, new microphone, new lights. We're upgrading for you guys. So hopefully you guys like it. Leave a comment below. Let us know what you think of the new setup. So I was moving and I had COVID, so things were a little bit busy, but I'm back. We're going to be hopefully back on our regular schedule, starting this week. And, I'm glad to have finally got COVID, actually. It took me 2.5 years to finally get it, despite my best efforts. And now I can boast that natural immunity. So all in all, totally worth it. And with that, we're going to get into this week's show. First of all, biggest story, hands down, is the Supreme Court in the Dobbs decision voting to overturn Roe v. Wade. This is a 50-year precedent that has finally been struck down by the Supreme Court that claimed women had a right to an abortion under the Constitution's unwritten right to privacy. And this supposed right to privacy has led to quite a few various decisions, including Griswold and Obergefell. And Clarence Thomas actually suggested in his majority opinion overturning Roe that this right to privacy could potentially cause these other precedents to also be overturned if they were brought before the Supreme Court. But let's start with this Roe v. Wade decision. What does it actually do? Because the immediate reaction from the left was to have meltdowns with people taking their shirts off outside the Supreme Court, and definitely not the people you want to see taking their shirts off and running around with these signs and body paint and just acting like total lunatics, crying that women are going to be thrown in the gulag and abortion is immediately illegal everywhere and we're living in the Handmaid's Tale, blah, 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 blah. What does overturning Roe v. Wade actually mean? It's pretty simple. All it does is say that there is no constitutional right for a woman to have an abortion, and therefore the laws regarding abortions should be decided by the states because we live in a system of federalism. States are the laboratories for democracy. They get to decide for their own little area, their own populace, what kind of laws they want to implement. And this is being touted by the left as undermining democracy and destroying our institutions and throwing the legitimacy of the Supreme Court into question. AOC actually suggested that the justices should be impeached for this decision. But there is actually nothing more democratic than saying that on the local level, people should be voting for elected officials who then get to make laws pertaining to the region that they are in charge of governing. That is a much more democratic system than a federal government making laws for the entire country. Even though we all live in vastly different regions, have vastly different politics, and things that affect us and ways that we view the world. So this should be celebrated by the left that claims to be concerned about democracy all the time. They're always talking about democracy. This is a democratic decision because it makes these decisions on abortion closer to the people. The people get a more direct say in what they want their states to do on abortion. There have been conservative states who had so-called trigger laws in effect where abortions were immediately outlawed. There are still really loose restrictions on abortion in states like California, New York, and liberal states that basically allow abortion up until the moment of birth. So you still, if you're a woman looking for an abortion, you can still travel to any state that allows you to have one. Would I like to see abortion outlawed across the country? Yeah, absolutely. Of course. But that's not what overturning Roe v. Wade does. So all of this hand-wringing, this hysteria from the left about overturning Roe is not based in reality. But you're still seeing these crazy reactions. Again, AOC wants to try to impeach the Supreme Court justices. I think that's only happened one time in history and typically is reserved for basically the same reason you would be able to impeach a president, which is for like a high crimes and misdemeanors, treason-esque reason. So this is something that doesn't really even have precedent. And obviously the Democrats are not actually going to do this. But you also had people like Susan Collins and Joe Manchin claim that they were misled by Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh in their meetings with them. And I wasn't in the meetings. I don't know exactly what the justices said, but Susan Collins was saying that they basically promised her that they would not overturn Roe v. Wade because it was precedent. And no justice would ever say that because it's not the justice's job to opine on cases that are not immediately before the court. They don't give their opinion on a case until the Supreme Court has chosen to consider it and they are actively reviewing the case and the decision comes down. They would never say, well, if this case hypothetically were to come before the Supreme Court, this is how I would rule. Any justice that would do that should not be confirmed because it's inappropriate. So I think more likely what happened, and this squares with what Gorsuch and Kavanaugh actually said in their testimony during the confirmation hearings, was that Roe v. Wade is precedent, yes. And just like any Supreme Court precedent, they would take a review of that precedent very, very seriously. So they wouldn't take it lightly if they were to overturn a precedent from the Supreme Court, from prior justices. And that is exactly how any Supreme Court justice should answer that question. So I think that Susan Collins and Joe Manchin are more just trying to save their own skin here because they know, at least with their moderate voters, that overturning Roe v. Wade is not super popular. And they're trying to distance themselves from their confirmation votes on these conservative justices to the overturning of Roe v. Wade. Then you also have people like Hillary Clinton, who I don't even know why she's opining on this. I wish she would just go away, but she always has to put her 2 cents in. And apparently she went to the same law school as Clarence Thomas, although I think they were in different years. But she claims to have some really in-depth psychological read on who Clarence Thomas is. And her whole interview that she gave on this, both explaining how she views Clarence Thomas and then what she thinks is going to happen when Roe v. Wade is overturned, is absolutely insane. Listen to this.
Justice Thomas has sort of floated that out there about contraceptive rights,
yes,
contraception, and about same-sex marriages. But other justices have pushed back to say, no, he's really sort of on his own with that.
Well,
Don't believe that?
Well, he may be on his own, but he's signaling, as he often did. You know, I went to law school with him. Mm-hmm. He's been a person of grievance for as long as I've known him. Resentment, grievance, anger. And he has signaled in the past to lower courts, to state legislatures, find cases, pass laws, get them up. I may not win the first, the second, or the third time, but we're going to keep at it.
So you're saying people pay attention to
yes,
this?
The people he is speaking to, which are the, right-wing, very conservative judges and justices and state legislatures. And the thing that there's so many things about it that are deeply distressing, but women are going to die, Gail. Women will die.
First of all, did she just peddle the angry black man trope? Sounds a little racist to me, Miss Hillary. But then she goes on and says that women are going to die because of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. And you hear this constantly from the Democrats, is that women are going to die. And what they're talking about is twofold. One, they're arguing that women who don't want to be pregnant are going to die because childbirth is inherently risky. And all of the studies that they use to make this claim are literally from before we had antibiotics. Like, you would get a cut on your arm and you would die because it would get infected. So these statistics clearly are not helpful in understanding the actual risks of childbirth today. Childbirth is very safe in the United States. And also, once you consent to sex, you thereby consent to possibly getting pregnant, because that is, in fact, the number one consequence of sex, particularly unprotected sex. But then the other reason that they claim women are going to die is they claim that there's going to be a ton of women getting these back alley abortions, coat hanger abortions, unsupervised abortions, and they are going to face complications. They won't go to the hospital because they don't want to get in trouble, and they will die. That also has no evidence to back it up. In fact, the Washington Post examined this claim from Planned Parenthood back in 2019. Glenn Kessler, who does the Pinocchio system, and I don't think anyone would accuse of being a conservative, gave this claim 4 Pinocchios because when he looked at the data, he found that certainly not thousands of women died every year like Planned Parenthood and the left claimed. And there was actually a negligible difference in deaths between women who had legal abortions versus women who had illegal abortions. So both were actually considered equal levels of risky. And the numbers were actually more in the 20s and 30s of women a year, not in the thousands. Obviously, every death is horrible. We like to try to prevent those, but we're also not just talking about the women in this situation. We are also talking about the baby. And we're saving potentially 1 million babies' lives every year when we outlaw abortions. So the whole bodily autonomy argument, the women's choice argument, falls apart under the slightest bit of scrutiny because there is another life involved in this equation. You wouldn't really have a left-wing meltdown unless you had a sort of washed-up celebrity publicly opining about what they're going to do in response to whatever happened. And in this case, you have the lead singer of Green Day, Billie Joe Armstrong, announcing at a concert that he was going to renounce his U.S. citizenship because he was so upset about the Roe v. Wade decision. Listen to this.
Fuck America, I'm fucking renouncing my citizenship. I'm fucking coming here. I just have too much fucking stupid in the world to go back to that miserable fucking excuse for a country.
Let's just be clear about the fact that Billie Joe Armstrong lives in California, right? He lives in a state with some of the fewest abortion restrictions, not only in the entire country, but in the world. California is on par with states like China. Most of Europe, where Billie Joe Armstrong apparently wants to go, actually has abortion restrictions after the first trimester. They actually mostly are stricter against abortion than the entire United States. But he's going to renounce his U.S. citizenship and leave California, the liberal utopia, to go to Europe. Doesn't really make much sense. The important thing to remember here, though, with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, is that the left had this last-ditch effort to try to sway the opinions of the Supreme Court justices. They leaked the draft opinion. They gathered outside of the justices' homes. One nutbag actually flew from California and went to Justice Kavanaugh's home in Maryland to attempt an assassination, which he then backed out of when he saw that Justice Kavanaugh's home was surrounded by U.S. Marshals. And none of it worked. They failed. demons failed. It's crazy. But that's what happens. These death cult weirdos historically always lose eventually. And it's such a great week to celebrate saving life, protecting unborn life, the most vulnerable, innocent population in our entire society. This is a great, great thing. And the only thing that can make it better is if Chief Justice John Roberts gets off his lazy ass and finds that leaker. We need to know who it is. They need to be blacklisted from the legal movement and sent home to their parents' basement. Lest we forget, but we have had several other victories come out of the Supreme Court in the past week, one of which was a case that upheld religious freedom rights. In this case, a high school football coach had started going to the 50-yard line after his team's football games, kneeling down and saying a prayer to himself. And some of the other students at the school saw him doing this and decided to join in with the prayer. And eventually there was basically a prayer circle after games. And the high school got so upset with this that they told the coach that he either needed to stop praying in public or he was going to have to leave the school. So he chose to get fired. He said, I'm not going to stop praying. You guys can fire me. And he ended up getting a lot of goodwill from conservative media. He decided to file this lawsuit. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld his right to pray. Absolutely beautiful thing. But if you read the dissent from the 3 liberal justices, it shows just how radical these justices are and just how nutty they are. I mean, these are left-wing activists. You can hardly even call these people judges. They said in the dissent, which was written by Sonia Sotomayor, that this coach should not have been allowed to pray, not because he didn't have religious freedom rights and that he didn't have free speech, but because of the reaction that his praying brought to the school. So after the school initially threatened him, this guy did a couple of media interviews and people ended up showing up to the games to support him. And after the games, some people from the stands would come down on the field and join him at the 50-yard line to pray. Sotomayor cited this one incident where a couple of members of the high school band were knocked over by these people coming down from the bleachers. And she says in her dissent that the coach should not be allowed to pray because of these people knocking over the band members. So doesn't even grapple with the fact that this guy is merely exercising his religion. She actually, if you take this to its logical conclusion, is saying that you're not allowed to have your free speech or your freedom of religion if people react in a way that she finds to be detrimental. If she doesn't like the way that people react to your speech, then you're not allowed to have that speech. You're not allowed to exercise that speech. That's crazy. And that is so divorced from the First Amendment. The whole point of the First Amendment is to protect your right to speak, even though people might not like it. I mean, that's literally what the Founding Fathers intended. And Sotomayor is reading the First Amendment in the exact opposite way, in the exact way that it was the exact thing that it was intended to protect against was people's reactions to speech that could potentially be offensive or speech that they didn't like. So these are the liberal justices on the Supreme Court. These are people who will literally warp the entire Constitution and the intent of the Founding Fathers to reach an outcome that they desire, that the left desires, that the Democrats desire. And yet the Democrats want to impeach the conservative justices because they're allegedly undermining the integrity of the court. Give me a break. And another victory, we're winning and we're winning so much and I'm still not tired of winning. Another Supreme Court victory. They upheld your right to have a firearm, concealed carry, without explaining yourself to the government. So there's a law in New York and there's a similar one in DC actually that essentially requires you to justify your need for a firearm. And this went to the Supreme Court, this New York law, and the Supreme Court said, no, The whole point of having a right enshrined in the Constitution, a God-given right that should be protected by your government, is you don't have to justify or explain why you need to exercise that right. You have the right. That's kind of the whole point of the thing. But luckily, the Supreme Court ruled the right way on this. But one undercovered story in the aftermath that I think is absolutely crazy is the lawyers who actually took this case to the Supreme Court and won were told by their law firm that they then had to drop their pro-Second Amendment clients or leave the law firm. And huge credit to these lawyers, because they said, we're not dropping our clients. We just want a Supreme Court case with them. We're going to leave. So they left the law firm. And it's because there's been this woke backlash, apparently, that this law firm has been getting from some of its more liberal clients who are upset that they are defending your constitutional rights. They should be celebrated for defending your constitutional rights. That's one of the most important roles of a lawyer in our society. And yet these lawyers were punished for doing it. So the Supreme Court case, huge victory, but the lawyers get punished. And then we can't even trust on Republicans in Congress to help protect our Second Amendment rights anymore. John Cornyn, the Republican senator from Texas, was responsible for these negotiations that led to the gun control bill being signed by President Joe Biden. And yeah, the bill could have been a lot worse. We could have had a ban on assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. Again, assault weapon, it's a made-up term. It doesn't mean anything. Basically means you won't be able to have the semi-automatic firearms that you know and love. They wanted to raise the age to be able to buy any gun from 18 to 21. They wanted universal background checks, which we basically already have except on private sales. And they wanted gun manufacturers to be sued if their weapons were used in violence. So basically, if you get in a car accident, you could sue Toyota. Makes no sense. So those things were removed from the law. So that's good. But why is there any Republican, and especially John Cornyn, who should know better, trying to strike a middle ground with people who are never going to be satisfied and are always going to demand more and don't even believe in your right to have a gun? They would outlaw all of them tomorrow if they could. But John Cornyn played the game with the Democrats and tried to justify it by saying, oh, well, we have to do something after Uvalde. Well, why don't we go fire all of the police officers who were standing in the hallway for an hour when the door was unlocked with shields and guns and heard the pops of the gunfire killing children and decided not to go in? Because so far, only one person has left the police force. The rest of them still have jobs. And yet we're supposed to believe the solution to that fiasco is lawful gun owners need to have their rights curtailed even further? What is John Cornyn thinking? Hilariously, if you go on his website right now, you know what you'll find? You'll find a page touting how he defends your right to keep and bear arms. Yeah, fucking right. What a liar. So he needs to do something after Uvalde so he can look good and he can get his street cred with the mainstream media and the liberals. And the law that ended up passing includes red flag laws, incentives for states to pass red flag laws. Do we really think that these red flag laws are not going to be used specifically to target conservatives? The Biden DOJ was creating threat tags for parents who protested at school board meetings and likening them to domestic terrorists. The Biden administration thinks that if you don't want your kid to transition to another gender and you don't want to chemically castrate your kid, then you should have your kid taken away from you. They think that taking your kid to a drag queen story hour is not grooming. They want to be able to teach kindergartners about woke gender ideology and teach them to hate their own skin color. And yet we're supposed to allow these nutbags the right to take away your firearms because they decide that you're the one who's mentally ill? Absolutely not. John Cornyn should be so ashamed of himself. He should not serve another minute in the Senate. This is despicable what he has done. Meanwhile, you have the Los Angeles Times. This is the type of people that John Cornyn is negotiating with. You have the LA Times releasing a news article questioning if California, after the Supreme Court decision, is ready for more black gun owners. I don't care what color the person is that has a gun. You have a right to have a firearm, to protect yourself and your family. You have a right to defend yourself against tyranny. You have the right to hunt and go shoot for sport and however you want to use your tool. That's a God-given right. And the LA Times is trying to make it about race. And again, those are the people that John Cornyn, a Republican, thinks are appropriate to negotiate with. You can't negotiate with these people. Don't give them an inch. This is crazy to me. So we'll see which states go ahead and actually pass these red flag laws and take these so-called incentives. Because I can promise you don't want to live there. Because they will do anything possible and come up with any reason to violate your due process and take away your right to defend yourself and your family. We've now learned that 51 migrants died in the back of a tractor trailer that was brought across the southern U.S. border into Texas. And these individuals were discovered because a few that were still alive were apparently knocking on the doors of the truck and begging for help. The authorities found them and said they opened the doors to find bodies stacked high because these people had perished in the sweltering Texas heat. The driver of the tractor trailer had apparently been high and had abandoned the truck, causing these people to lose their lives. It's an absolutely tragic situation. It's actually the deadliest situation involving migrant deaths near the U.S. border in recent American history. And why is this happening? Well, Texas Governor Greg Abbott said that this is because of Biden's open border policies. And frankly, I have to agree. I covered immigration pretty heavily when I was a White House correspondent for the Daily Caller. This was one of my big issues that I really focused on. I talked to a lot of various members of DHS. I talked to Border Patrol agents. I talked to the director of ICE. And they all were very clear. When you incentivize illegal immigration because the individuals who are coming to the United States do not believe that they're going to face serious or criminal consequences, you are emboldening the coyotes who make thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars from these desperate individuals who would like to cross the border and have no regard for human life. So these coyotes take this money because the people who are trying to cross the border are of the understanding that they will likely be able to get across illegally because we have tons of gaps in enforcement. And if they do get caught, nothing that bad is going to happen to them. They might get removed. They can try again in a couple of months. Maybe they'll get a civil fine. They might even be able to claim asylum, in which case they will get a court date. They'll be released into the United States and they don't even have to show up for the court date. So that's a de facto open borders policy where people who cross illegally are able to get entry into the United States and then stay here indefinitely. Under the Trump administration, they recognized that if you have these loose border restrictions, then coyotes are going to take advantage and you're going to see this horrible loss of life. Or as President Trump at the time pointed out, a third of the women who make this dangerous journey across the border end up being sexually assaulted. You have people who drown in the Rio Grande River. You have these incidents where people die of heat stroke in the back of trucks. List goes on and on. So the Trump administration implemented numerous policies to try to combat this, showing that they were going to be tough on the border so that fewer people would actually try to make the journey. They had a deal with Mexico, an agreement where Mexico actually stepped up its own border enforcement. You had the Remain in Mexico policy, so there wasn't as much of an incentive for people to falsely claim asylum because they wouldn't be released into the United States. They would actually have to go back and wait in Mexico. You had what many people called the family separation policy, which wasn't a de facto family separation policy. Actually, what it was is that they had a no tolerance policy for illegal border crossers. So every illegal border crosser would be prosecuted. And what that meant, thanks to the Flores settlement back from the 1990s, was that adults who remain in detention over a certain period of time are not allowed to stay with their children because they do not want many adults and children outside of family units staying in a detention center together. It was intended to protect the children. So that was why they were being separated, because they were being detained over a certain time period that by law, they were not allowed to stay with children as opposed to being released into the United States. So the Trump administration and the border wall, the Trump administration also repaired major sections of border wall. The reason they did all of those things was to try to disincentivize people crossing the border illegally, because they knew that if they got caught, things would be very uncomfortable for them and they would probably be prosecuted. They would not get entry into the United States. What did the Biden administration do? They undid all of those policies. They reneged on the Mexico-US agreement. They're trying to renege on the Remain in Mexico policy, although the courts aren't letting them. And they also are talking about issuing a moratorium on deportations. And they want to lift Title 42, which allows expeditious removal of illegal migrants under a global pandemic because of the spread of COVID. So migrants are now hearing that the Biden administration is planning on lifting Title 42. And what are they doing? They're creating caravans again because they're going to try to cross the border because, again, they believe that the Biden administration is not going to strictly enforce border policies. So it is open border policies that lead to things like this. What else leads to things like this? Well, Governor Greg Abbott actually had a policy implemented a couple of months ago where he was checking every single truck that was coming across the southern border. And people criticized him for that because of the supply chain issues that have been taking over the country, again, thanks to the Biden administration's negligence. And they said, Governor Abbott, you can't be checking every single truck. You're slowing things down. You're stopping Americans from getting the goods that they need. And you're exacerbating the supply chain issues. So Greg Abbott lifted this guidance, said, we're not going to check every truck now. And this is the result. 51 migrants dead in the back of a tractor trailer because it apparently wasn't checked coming across the southern border. So when the Democrats and the left talk about compassion for people who want to come into the country illegally, about their poor economic conditions or the gangs or the drugs or the violence, it's not compassionate to encourage people to take this dangerous journey. And what about compassion for the American people? What about compassion for the people who should have national sovereignty, for the people whose jobs could be taken by these individuals, for the people who have to live with MS-13 violent gangs, for the people who have fentanyl coming into their communities and poisoning their family members, their brothers, their sisters, their friends? There's nothing compassionate about an open borders policy, and you can see it in this story about 51 migrants dying in the sweltering Texas heat in the back of a tractor trailer. That's it for this week's episode of Unfit to Print. Thank you guys so much for watching. And again, if you like this episode, please subscribe on YouTube, Rumble, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. And if you would like to become a paid subscriber and get access to all kinds of bonus content, you can head on over to amberathey.supercast.com. Sorry, I still sound nasally. I still have some lingering COVID symptoms, but really excited to be in the new place. Again, let me know in the comments what you think of this episode. Subscribe, leave good reviews, and we will see you guys next week.